pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roll with planet.
Water towers fly!
Flight downside of speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where you are looking live at Space Launch Complex 40, the launch site for today's Falcon 9 mission carrying 60 Starlink satellites to low Earth orbit. My name is Thomas Berker. I'm an editor and reporter for NASASpaceflight.com, bringing you live coverage of this morning's launch. We are at T-minus 48 minutes just about and counting. Getting close to the start of the actual countdown and fueling sequence for today's launch, and everything appears to be on track. Before we start previewing the launch, let's talk about who else is on. We've got Michael Baylor in the studio. Michael, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and hopefully we will see an on-time launch today because, of course, this is a Starlink launch, which means there are no opportunities for holds in the countdown. If there are any issues, it will be a scrub. So fingers crossed that this will be the only morning this week that we have to get up bright and early for a Starlink launch.
Completely agree. Today's launch is targeted for 4:28 a.m. Eastern Time or 8:28 UTC. Another early morning launch like the most recent ones have been, targeting that orbital plane that just so happens to line up with Cape Canaveral early in the morning here on the Space Coast. Also joining the NSF team today, not on our broadcast, but we have Julia Bergeron and Stephen Marr, both out at their respective photography locations to cover tonight's launch as well. This morning's launch, I keep calling these launches night launches. It feels like it's still tonight, but it's the morning. And they'll be offering some photography of today's launch as well. But for now, if you have any questions about today's launch, please feel free to start putting those into chat. If you tag us with @NASASpaceflight, we are able to see those a little bit better, and we'll try to answer them as best we can during today's broadcast. But for the start, I will just give a brief overview of what we're expecting today. If you are a newer viewer around here, you may not be too familiar with the standard Starlink mission. If you've been around for a little bit, you know there's been a whole bunch of these recently, and this mission is not too terribly different from any of the previous missions. On board Falcon 9 today are 60 Starlink satellites for SpaceX's satellite internet constellation, destined for low Earth orbit. Today's launch will fly to the northeast of Cape Canaveral, lifting off from Pad 40, like you see on your screen, to a 53-degree inclination orbit. After the initial phases of flight, the first stage, which is booster 1060-6, that is booster 1060 making its sixth flight, will attempt a landing on Of Course I Still Love You, which is the drone ship on task for today's mission. And that will hopefully make a successful landing in preparation for a seventh flight later this year. The booster 1060 debuted on the GPS-3 SV-03 mission, also flew 3 different Starlink missions, as well as the TurkSat-5A mission, which was SpaceX's first launch of the year. So those were its 5 previous missions. Another bit of reused hardware on today's Falcon 9 stack are the 2 payload-faring halves. One half flew on the Sentinel-6A mission from Vandenberg last year, and the other flew on a previous Starlink mission, so both halves making their second flights today. Those fairings will also be attempted to be recovered once again today by a new addition to the SpaceX recovery fleet, Shelia Bordelon, which is a new ship that has showed up at Cape Canaveral to take over fairing recovery duties, at least for the interim, while SpaceX works on their more dedicated fairing vessels, Go Mystery and Go Mischief, which are currently sitting in Port Canaveral getting work done. We talked about this on some previous live streams. We're not sure what the permanent forward plan on fairing recovery may be. SpaceX appears to be pivoting a bit and adjusting that plan, and this new ship is a part of that. So a good luck to Shelia Bordelon and her crew on their first SpaceX mission today. Those fairings will be descending under parafoil and splashing down a bit further downrange than the drone ship and be recovered after splashdown by the recovery vessel. Meanwhile, the second stage will continue on towards orbit. It is a 2-burn flight profile for the upper stage today. So the upper stage will complete its first burn and then coast for about 45 minutes before a very brief second burn that lasts just about a second prior to deploying the 60 Starlink satellites about an hour after liftoff. So that is the standard Starlink mission flight profile today. Again, liftoff is targeted for 4:28 a.m. Eastern Time, 8:28 UTC. And while that is the opening of a window on the range, they only have this one time opportunity to reach their orbital plane today. So it is effectively an instantaneous launch window, unless they decide in the next about 6 minutes to change to the second orbital plane in the window, which they haven't not done recently, so we're not expecting that. Once they enter that terminal countdown, they are committed to that 4:28 a.m. liftoff time. What we will expect to see next at T-minus 38 minutes, we will hopefully hear on the SpaceX countdown nets that they are pulling go, no go for propellant load, and we should hear them say go for propellant load prior to fueling starting at T-minus 35 minutes. So those are the next big milestones we're looking at to make sure that we are still on track for today's launch. As far as what we can see so far, we have not heard about any technical issues being worked, and also the weather is very, very good today. Weather was forecasted 90% favorable for today's launch, a 90% chance of favorable weather. And right now the sky is mostly clear, and the water between us at the press site and the launch complex is perfectly still, no wind to speak of. So as best we can tell, no weather constraints that would affect today's on-time liftoff as well. Of course, that depends also weather downrange in the recovery areas could also be a factor. We'll know we're still good there once SpaceX pulls go for propellant load. So that's kind of where we sit for today's launch. Michael, do we have any questions we can start answering while we get towards the start of tonight's countdown?
Yes, a couple of super chats to get us going. Eric with a generous $25. Here's some money for you guys that don't sleep. Glad I'm not alone. Thank you so much for the support, Eric. Brady says, love your streams watching from Canada, and I can't wait for Thursday for SN11, hopefully hopping. Do you guys think it will hop then? Well, unfortunately, Brady, we might have some bad news on that, right, Thomas?
Yeah, so last we heard that the road closures for Thursday have been canceled, and thus the actual no earlier than target for SN11 could technically be Friday. It appears that they have canceled that opportunity on Thursday. I don't believe we have new road closures for Friday yet, but just inferring from the knowledge that they have canceled a closure on Thursday means that they are targeting the next day at the earliest. So we are standing by for a new official target, a date with both like a road closure and an airspace closure. But Starship SN11 will likely not be making its hop attempt today, Wednesday, or Thursday. Perhaps Friday could be the next day they try that. We're standing by for some more information about closures and things to have a more firm target, but Thursday is not looking likely for Starship.
Musical Wolf says, happy birthday, Falcon Rockets, enjoying some cake. Rough
Oh,
Riders,
yes.
oh, go ahead.
Absolutely. So that is another bit of trivia about today's launch. Today is the 15th anniversary of SpaceX's first ever orbital launch attempt with Falcon 1, all the way back in 2006. Of course, the first ever orbital launch of Falcon 1 failed pretty shortly into flight, but of course that was 15 years ago, and in those 15 years, SpaceX has made a fair bit of progress, I think it's safe to say, making orbit on the fourth flight of Falcon 1, debuting Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, and of course, we all know Falcon 9 is a very reliable rocket these days. But yes, happy birthday to the Falcon family of rockets.
And then Rough Riders asks, after a while, will Falcon 9 ever launch from Boca?
That is a good question, and funnily enough, when SpaceX unveiled that they were developing a private launch site in Boca Chica, it was actually intended to support Falcon family launches, Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. However, more recently, a couple years ago, it became clear that that launch site was going to be tailored directly for the Starship, Operation Starship, and Super Heavy, and so I do not believe there are any plans left on the table for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy from Boca Chica. They will continue operating from Cape Canaveral, both at Pad 40 and Pad 39A, and then over at Vandenberg at Launch Complex 4. But no Falcons from Boca Chica anymore.
When is the next West Coast launch?
That's another good question. I don't know if we have an official answer. I know the DART mission, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, has slipped to November, I believe. That might be the next one that technically has a firm launch target as far as an actual date goes. I think it's just targeted for November. I don't know if it has a more specific date than that. There are other missions on SpaceX's manifest for the West Coast later this year, but I don't think any of them have very firm launch targets, so I don't want to claim that there's any launches necessarily even before that. But there are a few other missions from Vandenberg. I believe there's a mission called Sarah, which is a search and recovery support satellite. There are, I think, what other missions? There's the Transporter 2 mission, which we're not sure will launch from Vandenberg or Florida here. There are, and there's a couple other missions on the Vandenberg Manifest that I'm blanking on right now. But none of those have really firm launch targets. So later this year is about as specific as I can get with that. But hopefully we will see a few Vandenberg missions later.
I'm not sure if you're asking about SpaceX from Vandenberg or any
Oh, that's
launch from
true. I
Vandenberg.
limited it to SpaceX mission. The next
Yeah,
Vandenberg launch period should be a Delta IV Heavy from United Launch Alliance on a mission for the National Reconnaissance Office, which I believe is scheduled for no earlier than next month.
LDs go for prop load.
And we just got a call out from SpaceX Countdown.net that the launch director is go for propellant load. So everything on track for today's launch. We're at T-minus 38 minutes. That propellant load operation will begin at T-minus 35 minutes.
in chat, let me know if you heard that call out okay. The SpaceX nets don't talk very much, so it's nearly impossible for us to make sure the audio is balanced correctly in advance, but from my monitor, that looked like that came through pretty good. So hopefully you heard that call out, and we will continue to listen into those call outs throughout the countdown. A couple more questions. Do we know how many operational Falcon 9 boosters there are?
We do, I think. If I had my computer in front of me, I could pull it up. Michael, you might have access to a list of some.
So right now, today's booster is B1060.
Yep.
That is obviously the one that we will start with. Then there is B1063, which was just moved from Vandenberg to the East Coast, so that's another one to have available. They also have B1058, which launched the Demo 2 mission last year, and that has currently flown 6 times. There is B1049, which just became the first Falcon 9 to fly for a 9th time. And then there is B1051 just flew for the 9th time. B1049 is currently on 8 flights. So those are the current boosters that are actively flying. There are also those 2 Falcon Heavy side boosters that have not flown for quite a while now. And then there is B1061, which will fly next month on Crew 1. But that booster is reserved. But it is operational. It's just not launching until after Crew 1. It's been reserved by NASA for that mission. So until that mission's out of the way, it's not allowed to launch anything else. And then there's one more like that, Thomas. It is
Right.
B1064, which is being reserved for GPS mission.
Right. So I think that's total. If you count the reserved ones, we're up to about 7, not counting the Falcon Heavy side boosters. So there's a few, and they will be expanding that. They did just deliver the Falcon Heavy Center Core for the USSF-44 mission to Vandenberg. So since that has been delivered, the next core to come from Hawthorne will likely be a Falcon 9 stage to continue growing that fleet as they continue to support their launch cadence. I should also report that here at the press site, we just heard the ground support equipment come to life over at Pad 40. So another sign that fueling is about to get underway in just about 30 seconds here. But everything on track for today's launch.
And we should expect to see that call out for the propellant load starting here in a second.
Yes. Once that does get called out and starts, we will start to look around the rocket and look for some signs of the air around the rocket condensing due to the super cold propellants being pumped in. And that'll be a visual sign that fueling is underway. We'll keep an eye out for that in the next few minutes.
Let's see. When is Crew 2 launching?
The SpaceX Crew 2 mission is currently targeted for April 22nd.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And launch auto sequence has started, so there's confirmation that fueling is now underway. April 22nd, I believe it's about 5 a.m. local time. I'd have to look up the exact T0, but it's an early morning launch, kind of like this one, from Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center on April 22nd, and that will be the launch of 4 astronauts, 2 NASA astronauts, a French astronaut for the European Space Agency, and a Japanese astronaut for JAXA, launching to the International Space Station on the second operational Crew Dragon flight.
Cool. So, a couple more super chats. Connor says, sleep deprived Floridian here. Hope we all get some rest soon. And along those lines, Thomas, we have a question from Joe. Why have there been so many early launches?
That is a good question. So unfortunately, rocket launches almost never get scheduled due to what time of day is convenient for the launch teams and those who cover these launches. They are almost always dictated by some sort of law of physics, if you will. In this case, we're talking about orbital mechanics and what orbit these satellites actually need to get into. So these satellites are destined for a specific orbital plane that SpaceX wants to start filling with these Starlink satellites. And that plane is independent of the Earth's spin. So basically, in order to launch satellites into a specific plane relative to the Earth, you have to launch when your launch site is below the orbital plane. And so it just so happens that this particular plane that they want the next batch of satellites to go into passes over Cape Canaveral at about 4:28 a.m. Eastern Time, and therefore that is when the launch will have to take place. Um, this goes for most launches going to orbit have these sort of requirements. If you have a mission going to the International Space Station, you have to launch into the ISS's orbital plane, and therefore you launch when that passes overhead. If you are launching to a geostationary orbit, which is another very common orbit, you have a little bit more leeway, and those are not so instantaneous launch windows. So when we talk about a launch window, it is effectively instantaneous if the launch vehicle's performance only allows for a little bit on either side of that liftoff time, so much so that you don't have time to recycle should a hold occur during the countdown. Um, for Falcon 9 mission to the International Space Station, I believe technically they have like a 5-minute launch window or something, which is effectively instantaneous once you start fueling. Different rocket performances may change that ever so slightly, but missions to the ISS or to very specific orbital planes have very strict launch windows. Versus going to geostationary, where technically the time that you launch does not affect your ability to reach a certain orbit because the orbital slot you're going to is relative to the Earth's surface. So at any time of day, the flight profile is actually the exact same thing to get to that orbit. What dictates a geostationary orbit launch window is normally the requirements of that spacecraft and how much sunlight it needs early on in the flight, or how long it can go after payload separation without sunlight to power itself. That's usually what kind of dictates those things. Also, things like thermal loads, about how much time it'll spend in sunlight before it deploys all of its thermal systems and things like that. Um, so that's why geostationary window launches usually have a bit of a longer launch window. Um, things like interplanetary launch windows usually have a decent launch window because you'll sit in the parking orbit for a bit and then do whatever burn to go if you're going to the moon or you're going to Mars. Since you do that interim step of sitting in a parking orbit, you can usually have a longer launch window for those kind of missions too. So it all depends on exactly where you are going in space. These Starlink missions are going to very specific orbits and thus need to launch at a very precise time. And recently, those times just happen to be pretty early in the morning.
Charlotte, thank you for the membership. Dougal says, any speculation on what the mystery structure is in Boca?
Mystery structure in Boca. You're gonna have to be more specific. I
I
feel like
think they're
there's more than
probably
one.
talking about the white label, the white pull thing, because that's what we have been labeling the
Oh
mystery
yeah,
structure.
I have exactly zero speculative ideas about what that might be. I don't know if Michael does, but I don't.
No, no
Um,
idea.
all I can say is that if the NSF team down in Boca Chica, notably Mary, figures it out or sees a label or something, we will report it best we can. But right now, I don't think we know.
Stuart says, today is my 20th birthday, and I have to ask why they don't land the boosters back down on the surface anymore. I think they're saying, like, why are there not many RTLS launches
Right.
these days?
Well, first of all, Stuart, happy birthday. Hope we get to light a candle for you this morning. Why don't we do many RTLS missions is a good question. So, most Falcon 9 missions require enough performance from the launch vehicle that it needs to land downrange. Whether they land on land or out at sea on a drone ship is dependent on how heavy the payload is and what orbit it's going into. The heavier the payload, the more energy is required to get it to orbit, and if it's going to a higher orbit, that also requires more energy to be expelled from the Falcon 9 rocket. And so most missions require enough performance from the vehicle that the booster can only land downrange. It doesn't have enough propellant left over to conduct a boost back burn and land here at landing zones 1 or 2 at Cape Canaveral. A couple missions in the past that have routinely used return to launch site profiles were the CRS missions with Cargo Dragon 1. However, since SpaceX has moved to Cargo Dragon version 2, which is a bit heavier and carries more payload, which is good for the customer, but since it's a little bit heavier, Falcon 9 cannot return to launch site after those launches anymore. So those launches are all doing downrange landings. That goes with the new crew missions, also using Crew Dragon, which is very similar to Cargo Dragon version 2, and obviously carrying crew and their supplies. So those missions all require downrange landings. So those International Space Station cargo missions, which used to produce a lot of RTLS landings here, no longer really happen. So the only missions you'll get return to launch site landings now are missions that are not too heavy, so things lighter than like a Starlink mission, which is actually the maximum payload a Falcon 9 can launch to low Earth orbit while still enabling downrange recovery. But as far as lighter payloads, if it's light enough and still going to an orbit like a low Earth orbit, those missions can return to launch sites. So the most recent one here at Cape Canaveral might have been Falcon 1B, unless there was one after that that I'm forgetting.
And our
I think.
oh,
Oh, NRO 108, that's true, which was also a low Earth orbit mission. So those were those were two recent ones that were both going to low orbits, and the payload wasn't super heavy. So the no pun intended there. So the first stage was able to come back and land at landing zone 1. But those are just a little more rare, especially because those CRS missions becoming drone ship recoveries.
and along those lines, do we know what the next RTLS mission is?
That is a good question. Okay. I don't know if we do. The next Falcon Heavy mission, which in the past have featured dual booster landings at the landing zones 1 and 2, will not feature RTLS recovery this time because the two side boosters will actually land downrange on drone ships, and the center core will be expended because that mission requires more performance from Falcon Heavy than any of the three prior missions so far. So it's not that one. Trying to think if there are any Falcon 9 missions on the manifest for RTLS. I believe the next one might be over at Vandenberg. Right now, there are no drone ships over at Vandenberg Air Force Base. We do know that SpaceX is in the plans to add a third drone ship called a Shortfall of Gravitas that could enable either that drone ship or a different drone ship to head back over to Vandenberg and support drone ship recoveries again from Vandenberg. But I don't know if there's any specific missions we know they need that to be ready for. So it's possible that the next mission from Vandenberg, whether that's DART or another mission, could be a return to launch site landing at landing zone 4, which is the landing pad over in California. I can't actually think of any missions that are slated to go from Cape Canaveral that will be returned to launch site off the top of my head. Michael, you can correct me if I'm missing any.
No, I cannot. I mean, the only mission I believe is confirmed to have an RTLS that I can think of off the top of my head is that's not the next Falcon Heavy mission, but the one after,
Right.
which
So
is
the
USS F-52. I
right
believe.
that
I'm not actually
mission.
positive. I'm pretty sure that is the standard dual RTLS and drone ship recovery of the center core.
I believe you're right. I believe that mission will be the Falcon Heavy recovery configuration that we're used to.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions about viewing the launch, so maybe a general overview of where this launch is headed and what inclination and where you could view that from.
Yeah, sure. So, like the standard Starlink mission profile goes, today's mission will fly to the northeast of the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station along the eastern coast of the United States. So, if you have clear skies where you are viewing, if you are in central to northern Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, or North Carolina, perhaps even Virginia, or maybe even farther north than that. The farther north, the less likely it'll still be bright enough for you to see. But it is possible that if you are in any of those states along the eastern seaboard, you will get a glimpse of Falcon 9 tonight. I would look out to the east over the ocean. And again, this mission is going to a 53-degree inclination, so right along the coast of the United States. And there's a chance if you are on the East Coast that you can look to the east and see this launch should weather permit.
Yes, and RTLS stands for Return to Launch Site. I probably should have specified that.
Yes.
Thank you for asking that in chat. But Return to Launch Site.
tag on to the end of that question I just thought of too. We talked about 2 Falcon Heavy missions from now. We expect to have RTLS landings. There are also a lot of times there are a few Falcon 9 missions for customers like the National Reconnaissance Office and things like that. Those 10 types of reconnaissance missions usually go to low Earth orbit, and thus a lot of those types of missions end up being enable to a return to launch site landing. We don't usually know well in advance. We usually learn when it kind of comes up on the range, and then they announce that it's a return to launch site landing. But it's possible that some of those missions will end up producing landings here at Landing Zone 1. But we'll just have to stay tuned for that. But anyway, more questions.
Is a jellyfish possible with today's launch? So if you don't know, when the Falcon 9 launches at the right time, and the sun is still set, so it's dark from where our cameras are viewing the launch from, but the sun is close enough that, or the sun is positioned correctly so that as the rocket gets higher and higher, it ascends into daylight. The plume of the rocket can get lit up in the sky against that black, dark sky from the perspective of the camera, which can create what some people call the jellyfish effect. So, is that something we could see today, Thomas?
Can you check me what time is sunrise here in Florida today?
I believe the answer is going to be no, but let me make sure.
Right. I think we're slightly too early. It needs to be like about a half hour
sunrise
or
is
so.
7:05, so.
Right. So I think we're way too early this morning. Usually needs to be about a half hour before sunrise for that to take place. And right now with sunrise around 7 a.m. and launch at just before 4:30, you got a couple hours too early, unfortunately. So it is very possible at the very end of like stage 2 flight. Stage 2's exhaust might just get lucky and catch some sunlight, but I think we're even earlier than the last launch, which kind of got a very little bit of a jellyfish effect at the end of stage 2. I believe this launch is a little bit earlier with respect to sunrise, so I don't think we'll get that today, unfortunately.
Any guesses to when that booster that just flew for the 9th time will go for a 10th flight?
I believe our current turnaround for boosters is about a month to a month and a half. Is that about right, Michael? Between flights?
They've gotten about to a month now.
Right. So about a month. So let's say no earlier than late March. Granted, it is the first booster to fly 9 times, so they might do some more thorough inspections than the sort of rapid turnaround they have been doing. But I would say as early as later in March, or later in April, excuse me. Could be that first time a Falcon 9 flies for the 10th flight. And that will be a big milestone. SpaceX has kind of set that as their goal as far as how many missions they want to get out of a Falcon 9 first stage booster. However, that's also not a magic number where that booster will then be retired, as some people may have thought. As SpaceX learns more about these boosters, I believe we had some more recent comments from Hans Koenigsmann, which is the head of flight reliability at SpaceX, who said that basically we're going to get the booster after a booster flies 10 times, they'll get it back and they'll look at it. And if they see nothing that's too concerning, and they see that, yep, this fatigue is pretty similar to the previous flights, we don't see anything that'll preclude an 11th flight. They fully expect that the booster to keep flying after that. The early goals before they started getting up to those high numbers of reflights was we hope to get to 10 flights without needing major refurbishment prior to the 11th flight, basically. But that was an internal goal rather than what they expect to need to do. So SpaceX will keep learning from those boosters that are flying more and more often, and we'll see what the upper limit on a booster's reuse actually is. What you're seeing on your screen now is the T-minus 20
Stage 2 RP1 load complete.
As we hear, Stage 2 RP1 kerosene load is complete, so they are purging those ground support lines on the transporter erector with nitrogen, liquid nitrogen. So you're seeing that purge taking place in that nice big vent. That is completely normal and expected at T-minus 20 minutes in a Falcon 9 countdown, and it's just another visual indicator that everything is proceeding nominally. You can also see further down the rocket a little bit. You might catch some glimpses of some vapors as the first stage is also getting fueled with kerosene and liquid oxygen. Right now, Stage 2 liquid oxygen loading will begin about T-minus 16 minutes, and that'll be the final phase of fueling prior to flight. So everything on track as far as that is concerned right now. What you're actually seeing on your screen is the sort of the back of the transporter erector, which is the structure that rolls Falcon 9 out from its hangar and raises it vertical at the launch site. At the very top, you can see the fairing, the nose cone, sort of peeking out, and of course the rocket is underneath that. At launch, the transporter erector will move away from the rocket, kind of tilt away, and allow the rocket to lift off, and we'll get a more clear view of the rocket as it actually ascends. But right now, you can see that T-minus 20 event occurring and everything on track for launch so far.
Any idea when the Starlink satellites will be visible, if at all too early in the morning?
That's a good question. So I don't know the answer off the top of my head. There are, I believe, a couple websites, things like Heavens Above, Flight Club might still be doing those. That'll show you where the satellites will be visible on orbit after separating from the upper stage. Off the top of my head, I don't know any answers for that. They're also working on, remember, these Starlink satellites. They are, at least initially, they were very reflective and very bright, which actually can interfere with astronomy efforts that are based here on the ground. And so SpaceX has worked with a couple of groups, including NASA more recently, to continue to mitigate those efforts. And the new satellites all have these sunshades, which limit how much sunlight they're reflecting. After launch, they're still fairly visible if you know where to look, I believe. But off the top of my head, I don't know where you'd have to look. There are a couple websites like the ones I mentioned earlier. Heavens Above comes to mind. Um, as far as places you could look for that kind of information, I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Kylie Williams, thank you for the super chat. We are so used to the boosters being reused now that it will be a little sad when we will have to say goodbye to one of them for the Falcon Heavy launch. I
Yes,
agree
that
with
is
that.
true.
And Wesley asks, what is the altitude of the Starlink constellation?
So the initial phase of the Starlink constellation orbits at 550 kilometers altitude. That is a circular orbit. That is the initial phase. However, the Starlink constellation will consist of a couple different phases, a couple different shells of satellites at different orbits. I believe there is one shell that's a little bit above 1,000 kilometers altitude. I don't remember where some of the others are. They also keep adjusting those plans, so it's kind of pointless for me to tell you what the current plans are because they might change anyway, as they're kind of tweaking exactly what they want the constellation to look like. But these initial satellites, these version 1.0 satellites, part of the initial about 1,500 to 1,600 satellites in this phase, are going to 550 kilometers altitude. Today's launch will actually bring them up to, I believe, 1,320 version 1.0 satellites launched, and the initial phases consist of just under 1,600 satellites. So they're actually getting close to finishing it up that first orbital shell, and that they'll likely reach that goal in a couple months here, before starting to fill up some of the other orbital shells of the constellation.
Do the RCS thrusters need to be refueled after each flight?
The Falcon 9, so the Falcon 9 RCS thrusters are just cold gas thrusters. So they're not really fueled per se. It's actually just pressurized nitrogen that are thrown out the nozzle basically. But they are the nitrogen tanks that are on board do have to be refueled between each flight. They don't carry enough fuel for multiple flights. I don't think that would be inefficient design wise. So those are all, at least, I mean, they probably don't land with zero RCS fuel left, but they are refueled between flights almost certainly. Yeah.
Um, are there any possibilities for polar orbit Falcon Heavy flights from Vandenberg?
They could. They would have to modify Space Launch Complex 4 East for the purpose. The launch stand over in Vandenberg is currently only capable of supporting Falcon 9, but it is not unheard of for that to change. So Falcon Heavy from Vandenberg is not off the table. They would just have to modify the pad to accommodate it as such. Keep in mind that with the new kind of reopened polar launch corridor from Cape Canaveral, where rockets can fly south from here, conduct a slight dogleg maneuver, and reach things like sun synchronous orbit or other polar orbits. It might be easier for just a Falcon Heavy to launch from Pad 39A and fly along that corridor rather than configuring Vandenberg for Falcon Heavy. However, doing that dogleg maneuver and using the polar launch corridor takes a little bit of performance out of the rocket. And plus, Cape Canaveral is closer to the equator, which is good for eastbound rockets, but not so good for polar launch rockets. It's actually more efficient to launch from a farther north launch site like Vandenberg. So the vehicle performance of a polar launch from Vandenberg is slightly better. So it's possible that might justify setting up pad 4 at Vandenberg for Falcon Heavy. I don't think we've heard anything official that they are planning to do that, but it's possible. Right now, Falcon Heavy will stick to going from 39A though.
Uh, is Falcon 9 a type of rocket and there are multiple of them, or is this the same one and the turnaround time is getting faster? So I guess how many Falcon 9 boosters are we seeing in the rotation?
Right. So the Falcon 9 is a type of rocket, a class of launch vehicle. There are multiple Falcon 9 boosters, and I think earlier we counted about 7 that are currently operational, 7 boosters, in various stages of preparing for their next flights. So there's a rotation of boosters that they use to support their launch manifest. It's not the exact same booster flying over and over again. But of course,
Correct.
this particular booster has flown 5 times before and is making its 6th flight. They are, of course, reusing them. It's just not the same exact one over and over again.
When a booster is landing, are the legs deployed via hydraulic means or drops by gravity, and how are the legs locked in place?
So the legs on a Falcon 9, I do not believe are hydraulically put into place. They're just they're pushed away from the booster a little bit by I think some sort of pneumatic mechanism. But then the legs just fall the rest of the way um, due to gravity, and also the acceleration of the landing burn taking place applies some force that'll help them fall into place. And then once they reach their landed position, they automatically lock in place when they reach when they're extended fully. So I believe it is mostly gravity doing the work when Falcon 9 deploys its landing legs.
Will there be any upcoming launches during the daytime? It seems like we've been having a lot of early morning launches.
Right, so, excuse me. Starlink missions for the near term, we don't have the launch times for the next mission after this. So I don't know if there are any Starlink orbital plane launches that will wind up being daytime launches coming up. Um, the next external mission, which is Crew 2, is also a very early morning launch before sunrise. So actually, unfortunately, I believe the answer is we don't know of any upcoming launches that we know are scheduled for daytime, which is unfortunate. Also, other launches here from Florida. The next ULA launch from Florida will be an Atlas 5 mission in a few months. We don't have a launch time for that yet. Um, I don't think we have a launch time for the NRO mission over from Vandenberg on Delta 4 Heavy either yet. So yeah, I don't think we have any confirmed daytime launches coming up super soon. I would be surprised if they are all in nighttime, but for the near term, I think the ones we know about are still night launches for the next couple weeks or so.
When is the next Falcon Heavy launch?
So the next Falcon Heavy launch is for the United States Space Force, the classified USSF-44 mission, and that is launching, I believe, no earlier than this spring still, technically. May have slipped to this summer. I don't remember what the latest official date is. But pretty soon this year, maybe towards the middle of this year, we should see Falcon Heavy make its next flight.
Uh, do we know what the Starlink beta test time frame is for Europe?
Right now, I believe that there are some European nations that are already involved in the Starlink beta testing. I don't know the timeline on when that will be expanded further, but there are a few European countries, including the UK, which are now participating in the Starlink beta test program.
I think it's starlink.com is where you go to put in your address, and then it will tell you when Starlink will be available in your region. I know a lot of the United States is either already in beta or is expected to be in beta by the end of the year in pretty much all regions, but I'm not sure about the rest of the world. And of course, some countries require different regulatory approvals and whatnot, so regulatory approval might be another factor that could cause some variations in when Starlink is available for different regions. But um, We're getting lots of SN11 questions, so maybe a recap of when SN11 is going to fly, Thomas.
Right, sure. So the SpaceX operations over in Boca Chica, Texas, still ongoing. Starship SN11 finally passed its static fire test, and so they're preparing for launch. The latest news we have is that the road closures that were scheduled for Thursday have been canceled, which suggests that they are no longer targeting that day for launch, which is why we're thinking no earlier than this Friday for a possible launch attempt. But we don't have a firm launch target, and on Friday there are no closures scheduled yet either. They have not canceled closures previously scheduled for that day, so it sounds like that might be the next day. But unfortunately, we don't have a firm launch target yet, so stay tuned for that. Stay tuned to our social media and, of course, here to the NASA Spaceflight YouTube channel when we'll keep you updated on that launch timeline. But as of now, Starship SN11 waiting for a firm launch target, potentially as early as this Friday.
Yes, and I mean, there is a TFR, so there is some indication, which a
Right.
TFR stands for a temporary flight restriction. There is some indication that Friday could happen, but Cameron County, which is responsible for approving the road closures, has been trying to keep that road open as much as possible because it leads to a popular beach this time of year. So the local community wants to have that beach access as much as possible. Grace, thank you for the $5. Again, if you have questions, keep tagging us in chat. I'm doing my best to get through them. Do we know what the thrust of the Falcon 9 is?
The internet does. Off the top of my head, I don't. If that is something you can Google. If you go to SpaceX.com and click on the Falcon 9 page at the very top, that'll have some stats on the thrust of an individual Merlin 1D engine on the first stage, and then obviously you multiply that by 9. That'll be your total thrust of the Falcon 9. Off the top of my head, I do not know the number, but
I think it's around 7,600 kilonewtons.
There
But
you go.
I'm not sure how that's
That sounds about right.
changed. You know, I don't know how. I think that number has been on SpaceX's website for quite a while, so I don't know if that's been improved at all. But that is one answer. You can also just go with 3 if you know that, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, on a Falcon 9, the thrust is 9, right? Because 9 engines.
that's true.
I think that's how it works.
How's the robot fleet at Boca Chica going? The robot fleet in Boca Chica is doing great. We used it for the static fire of SN11 a couple of days ago, and it went great. But wow, lots of venting from Falcon 9 right now, Thomas.
Yeah, the air around Falcon 9 is condensing, and that's just an effect of the super cold RP1 kerosene and liquid oxygen. The fuel and oxidizer for Falcon 9 are both densified, made very cold, so you can effectively fit more of it into your stages. And as a result, the air around the rocket condenses, and what you're basically seeing is mostly water vapor, with a little bit of things like nitrogen or liquid oxygen being vented from the ground equipment and things like that. But it's mostly just water vapor condensing from the super cold rocket, and the atmospheric conditions allowing us to see a fair bit of vapors today.
Mindel, I think if I'm pronouncing that right, thank you for the $5 Australian. We appreciate everyone's support that helps pay for the expensive data that
Stage
is
1
required
RP1
to
load
power
complete.
these cameras. And there we just heard that the Stage 1 RP1 load is complete, so another good sign as we head under T-minus 6 minutes until liftoff. Thomas, how's the cloud cover looking?
Right now, it is almost completely clear. There's a couple sort of thin, wispy clouds in the area, but we can see plenty of stars here from the press side as well. So it should be a very good view of the launch today, hopefully.
And I'm looking at Fleet Cam at Port Canaveral right now. And it's hard to see with the bright lights of
it's
the
dark
port,
out.
but not
There's
seeing
very
many
thin
clouds.
clouds, so I think on Fleet Cam you're not seeing too many stars or anything. But here in person, you can see the clouds are very, very thin, and so we should still get a pretty good view of Falcon 9 today. Hopefully, sometimes the clouds can actually, very thin clouds can make the visuals look even better. So we'll see exactly how it turns out. But the weather is very, very good here.
Work for the company in charge of distributing the Starling terminals, and it always cheers me up to see them come through. I'll be damned
Pressing
if they
for
don't
strong back
clog up
retract.
our system like crazy when they all come through at once. So that call out we just heard was that the strong back retract was starting, which is the gray structure you see behind the rocket right now, or in front of the rocket from our perspective. A couple more super chats. What do you think about Super Heavy's engine section?
Strong back retract has begun.
I'm not sure. More specific than that? I mean, I guess we're talking about BN1 specifically. I don't know. I think that the plans for Super Heavy testing have changed a bit. We're not even sure what exactly BN1 will do. We don't think it's a flight test article anymore. Don't know if that means they'll just test the tanks with like a cryoproof or something like that, or if they will go to like a static fire of some kind. But the engine sections of the Super Heavy prototypes are changing a bit because they keep changing the testing plans for those prototypes. I think that's all I really have to say on that.
CPO Daywalker with a super generous $100 super chat. That's not the first time they have made a very generous contribution to the stream, so I appreciate their support a lot. Michael, here's some coffee money since today has been a long day for you. I really appreciate that. It is currently 1:25 a.m. in my time zone, and I have a class at 5 a.m. because my class is technically taking place in the East Coast remotely, but I'm on the West Coast, so that time zone hurts me badly. So I am not getting much sleep tonight, so I definitely appreciate that support. And I know, Thomas, you're not getting much sleep at all either because you're out there at 4 in the morning.
Yep, so we really do appreciate the support from Daywalker and everyone else as well. Greatly appreciated. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing, so thanks, guys.
Trying to find maybe one more. Oh, here's a super chat. Celadon, if I'm pronouncing that right, got my first paycheck at the new job, splurging a little. Thanks for all the coverage. Your earlier comment about the dual ASDS booster landing just gave me something else to look forward to. Yes, I'm looking forward to that too, and I'm excited to see a shortfall of Gravitas, the new drone ship, in action. But Thomas, you're approaching T-minus 2 minutes.
Absolutely. So we're getting into the business end of the countdown. Fuel loading and liquid oxygen loading into both stages will be finishing up now. And at this point, Falcon 9 will just be topping off the tanks and making sure they're ready for flight. A few minutes ago, they started thermally conditioning the first stage engines, the 9 Merlin engines, for ignition. They pumped just a little bit of liquid oxygen through the rocket engine's plumbing. And you can see stage 2 LOX load is complete according to the call out. They run a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through the engines to start cooling down those components so that they're not thermally shocked when the full flow of cold propellants goes through them at ignition. So that is underway, and you can see some more vending from the ground equipment here as we get to the final minute of the countdown. At T-minus 1 minute, Falcon 9 will enter startup, which is when the tanks are pressurized to flight levels, and Falcon 9 starts configuring itself for flight. The onboard computer is taking control at that point forward. And then, of course, we will have the engine start command at T-minus 3 seconds, and at T-minus 0, if everything is all A-OK, we'll have a liftoff. So at T-minus 60 seconds and counting, let's take our attention over to pad 40 for today's launch.
Cool. And Thomas, you are good to do your thing. I will take us through the final seconds of the countdown while Thomas does his best to operate our camera and give us some amazing tracking views of the launch. So we should have hopefully some great audio of this launch, if all goes well. Just coming up on T-minus 30 seconds. Under 20 seconds now. Again, this is the launch of 60 Starlink satellites to support SpaceX's global internet constellation. And we see the ignition, and it looks like we have a liftoff of the Falcon 9 with yet another batch of 60 Starlink satellites on their way to low Earth orbit. major events will be main engine shutdown on the first stage, followed by stage separation and ignition of the single Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage. That's coming up in just over 30 seconds or so from now. And you will see that plume on the Falcon 9 expand as it gets higher and higher into the atmosphere as the air becomes less dense. You can clearly see the plume of each of the 9 Merlin engines on Falcon 9 right now. That is a great track, Thomas, and an awesome shot of that flame. And Thomas, we are losing the audio now from the rocket as it gets further away, so if you want to talk too, you're good to go.
Right. Yeah, we had a thunderous liftoff. Falcon 9 approaching main engine cutoff and stage separation at this point. Standing by for that.
That looks like a main engine cutoff.
There's Miko. Stage separation. Standing by for stage 2 ignition. And I think I may have lost it at stage separation this time.
We'll go on board the
there it
Falcon
goes.
9.
Found it.
So we can see that happening on the SpaceX feed, which is a couple of seconds behind us, but good ignition on the MVAC engine as we can see that glowing bright red on our screen as it comes to life. And I always love that view, Thomas, of the grid fins getting lit up by the plume of the second stage. That is really cool. And then you can see the lights from Florida's coast in the background as well.
So now, Falcon 9 up, fairing separation.
Yep, there go the fairings. So everything looking good right now for this mission. And of course, the first stage is now going to begin that descent here shortly back to, of course, I Still Love You in the Atlantic Ocean, but it is still rising. If you look at that telemetry on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, the first stage is slowly climbing towards apogee, but in a couple seconds here, it will begin that descent.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Nominal trajectories. You can see the cloud cover is non-existent, and I believe I may have just lost the last sight of stage 2 that we're going to get here from the press site.
Acquisition of signal,
switch
Bermuda.
over to the SpaceX camera feeds.
And of course, the next major milestone for the first stage will be that entry burn, where it reignites its three of the 9 first stage engines as the first stage re-enters the atmosphere to help provide some heat shielding and to slow the vehicle down.
Meanwhile, stage 2 is continuing on towards orbit, already at 138 kilometers in altitude, already in space. It's just a matter of gaining that horizontal velocity needed to stay in orbit. But the first stage now back on the way down, falling back down towards Earth and preparing for that entry burn in a couple minutes here.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Again, to call, we want to hear that all the trajectories are nominal. But we'll see what kind of video we get from the drone ship today of that landing. It seems to be pretty hit or miss whether or not the connection holds, as we see a shot of the empty launch pad from Thomas's camera. Always a good sign to see that, especially when a scrub would have meant us getting up early again tomorrow morning. But Falcon 9 is off the pad, as you can clearly see on your screen right now.
Yep, Falcon 9 went on the first attempt for this mission, which is always a good thing for us. One trip down, see the launch, and we're all good to go. Of course, the most important thing is the mission being completed successfully, so we're going to keep our eyes on that upper stage, as well as that first stage, because we want that one back as well.
This would be the 6th landing of booster B1060 so far, so it is making its 6th flight today, and if all goes well, it should be turning around for a 7th flight in just about a month or so. SpaceX is flying all their boosters pretty regularly right now, unless they are reserved for a customer.
Stage
Here
1
comes the
FTS is
anti-burn.
saved.
And the flight termination system on the first stage has
Stage
saved,
1
as
entry
it
burn
gets
startup.
closer to landing. And the entry burn has started. We're standing by for the video feed to catch up with the callouts there. There you go. So that's 3 of the Merlin engines on that first stage firing up to slow the stage down and protect itself during that early phase of reentry.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And a nominal entry burn shutdown call out, so that occurred as scheduled.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
And right before they switched camera feeds, you saw I think the one of the grid fins start to glow a little bit as it goes through the rest of the reentry heating. But we'll keep an eye on that first stage telemetry. You can see the speed still decreasing. That's because atmospheric drag is now slowing down the booster. They're no longer firing the engines, but it is still slowing down dramatically as it descends towards the drone ship. Like Michael said, this would be the 6th landing. All 6 landings happening on drone ships for this booster.
And a lot of people think that the reason they lose the first stage video there is the re-entry heating, but I'm pretty sure it's just simply because it goes over the horizon of the ground stations as the vehicle gets lower and lower over the horizon while it descends towards the drone ship. But that is why, if it's like an RTLS, you see the video feed all the way towards landing.
Yeah. And obviously they still have a telemetry link with the vehicle because, well, they're displaying telemetry on the bottom left of your screen. So they don't have 0 data coming from the booster.
Yeah. They actually even use the drone ship to get some of that telemetry.
Stage 1 landing burn startup.
But here comes the landing. So hopefully we will get a good landing of Falcon 9. And of course, I still love you here momentarily. Oh wow, they got the video back.
And right on cue, we have the onboard video just to mess with Michael. Although you can see the downlink is not too stable. There's the camera from onboard the drone ship.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
Stage 2 has entered terminal guidance.
Stage 1 landing confirmed. Waiting for the video to catch up there, but launch control is confirming that landing was
bottom
successful.
left. That's
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Which is usually a good sign to have the rocket. There it is.
And there's an onboard camera view after landing. Very cool.
This is new.
Yeah, they haven't
it
really
just
shown
happened
that
because I said that, but this is
I think
new.
it's because
we
you
have
said
never,
that.
we have never seen onboard video of a Falcon 9 on a drone ship when it did not land on a drone ship.
Expected loss of signal, Cape Canaveral.
Right,
So,
yeah, when the drone ship was way
if I
closer.
had to guess, they are working on experimental technology to use
Nominal parking orbit
the
insertion.
drone ship recovery vessels as a ground station to relay that video. So that was new. That was very cool. We saw they did lose the video right as it was landing, but hopefully with some improvements, they might be able to get, a continuous live feed even on these remote drone ship landings.
That was very cool. Also, the Stage 2 has entered its initial orbit successfully, and
Acquisition
therefore
signal,
we're all good to
Newfoundland.
go on that front. Again, the Stage 2 will coast for about 40 minutes or so, prior to a very brief 1-second burn to circularize its orbit a bit, and then payload deploy will come about an hour after liftoff. But as for us here at Cape Canaveral, the early phase of launch has gone perfectly
Awesome
so
view
far.
of Falcon 9.
And there's another great view. B-1060 landed on Of Course I Still Love You after its 6th flight, ready to fly for a 7th time after being brought back to Port Canaveral. But while the second stage continues its coast phase here at the press site, we're going to start packing up our camera. I'll stay on comms for a little bit, Michael, but just so you know, our camera feed will go offline.
Okay, I'm just going to wrap up the super chats, and then I think we will all get some rest. So about 4 in our queue, it looks like. Jonathan, thank you for the $10. Will Rutherford ever have superconducting motors? Prop is already cryo.
Talking about Rocket Lab now?
I guess, yeah.
I don't think they're going to make any changes to the Rutherford engine. It's pretty much operational as it is, so they probably don't want to make that kind of difference.
Axie says, go Internet Rocket Go. Thank you for the support. Steven, thank you for the membership. And Slava with $20. Great coverage, guys. Appreciate your wild effort on this. Yep, it is always hard to deal with these crazy launch times, but that was a lot of fun, and that I'm really hopeful that that video at the end of that landing, the onboard footage was quite cool. So I'm hopeful that in the future SpaceX will be able to have a solid first stage video link from the booster. But there you see that sun rising. And I think with that, we're going to wrap up our broadcast. Of course, if you want to continue to follow the mission, SpaceX's official webcast will remain live through until spacecraft separation at about an hour into the mission. But thank you all for watching. Thank you to Thomas for being out there in the field with the camera super early in the morning. He is at PJ MetsFan98 on Twitter. If I can get his name to appear on screen properly. There we go. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Absolutely, and thanks, Michael, for being on today, and thank you everyone
Expected
for
loss
tuning
of
in
signal,
and for all your
Bermuda.
support. Glad you
I
joined
know
us
why
on the
your
early
name
morning
is
launch.
showing up. It's because I don't have our overlay on the scene. But anyways, thank you all for the support. I am Michael Baylor for NASASpaceflight.com, and we will see you all next time. I mean, our next broadcast might be the SN11 flight test, so make sure you don't miss
Yeah,
that.
probably.
If not, it'll be NSF Live on Saturday, I think. But until next time, see you all later, and have a good morning, good evening, wherever you are on the world.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
The chamber pressure looks good.
Doubling up. Roger roll, Atlantic. Flight downside speed off. Off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.